Green,
Yes.
thank you. So, Ryan, you were listening in, I think, on the last half hour anyway of testimony, and know that we're looking at H128, and we had a walkthrough last week, and I don't think we've taken any other testimony. We had some questions about, as you heard again just now, what does it actually mean to talk about soil mitigation, and what does that look like in practice? So hopefully you're here to help us answer those questions.
Absolutely. Thank you for the record. Ryan Patch with the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. I'm here with Steve Collier, General Counsel, and Ari Rockman-Miller, who is Program Coordinator for the agency's Act 250 Criterion 9B review, which is primary ag soils. I am the policy manager. Been here to talk about climate, here now to talk about the land use side of my work, which the agency's work, which focuses on ag land conservation, as well as the review of impacts to primary agricultural soils through the Act 250 review process, as well as the Section 248 process. And to pick up where we'll end the dialogue and orientation to these programs and their review criteria, there are distinctions between both the statutory constructs between Act 250 and Section 248 and how primary agricultural soils are reviewed and how and when mitigation is required. And so to talk about that last section and maybe where there are distinctions between the Act 250 process and the 248 process. But I also wanted to just share with the committee a very brief summary of the current status of land that's used for agriculture in the state of Vermont and what the trends have been, as I think it can help inform, I think, why these review criteria have been added to these development permits, whether it's Act 250 or for energy projects for Section 248, and why agricultural land conservation is important for a future of Vermont. As a punchline, we have been losing agricultural land for a number of years, and it's a finite and valuable resource. You folks will have seen this graph before, which is the representation of land cover in Vermont. 73% forested, 12% agriculture. We know that farmers manage both agriculture and forest, and so they'll manage somewhere around 20% of Vermont's land base. As you know, this hasn't changed. Back in the turn of the late 1800s to the 1900s, it was about 70% open and around 30% forested. Those factors have flipped in a little over 100 years. Now, just to try to contextualize how I think farmers in Vermont need to be lauded for their endeavoring to farm the state, I have a series of representations of limitations to farming. This is a LiDAR map of the state, and you can show the kind of topographic challenges that exist as far as the mountain ranges that run down the spine of Vermont. Further, if you were to categorize those slopes as well as other limitations, we know highlighted in yellow here and then red and orange where they overlap, we have a lot of steep slopes greater than 15%, and we have a lot of soils that have a very shallow depth to bedrock. When you then add on those soils that are either categorical wetlands under the Vermont Surface Water Inventory or hydric soils, we can see that Vermont has a lot of steep, very stony, very wet soils. And so what's left to farm? Well, certainly people endeavor to farm those types of soils, but much of that may have been the old sheep farms that are no longer grazing at those elevations. What I attempt to put here is a attempt to look at where does farming happen. You can see the three big ag counties, Addison, Franklin, Orleans counties, and you can see that represented in these more major blocks of yellow in these regions. And when you look in, let's see if this will zoom. Woo, maybe it will. I'm just, this is not very scientific, right? But overlaying like where there are not these restrictions is very often where you find farming. And there are very, up here in Franklin County around the Missisquoi, right, you can see some really nice open flat land. And you also then see very heavy concentrations of agriculture in those areas. And so where does farming happen? Where soils are most conducive to be farmed with the least restrictions possible. And so this is just a way to show the amount of soils that don't meet those limitations are finite, and a small percentage of Vermont's land base. You've also seen this graph before, but I always like to bring up the breakdown of the land that farmers manage in Vermont. This is from the last Ag Census, and in May we expect to have the updated results from the 2022 census, so very much looking forward to that. When you look at land that is in permanent pasture and land that is in harvested cropland, and you compare that to woodland that farmers manage, we can see it's pretty much a one-to-one breakdown of land that's in cropland pasture and land that is in forest land. And so when we talk about farmers and farming, it's a lot more than just the pasture, the corn, the vegetables, the orchards. There is a whole lot of other attendant land that may be in silviculture, may be in sugar making, but is certainly in a wooded state. Since 1987, this is according to that Ag Census that's conducted once every 5 years, Vermont has lost 32% of its cropland, a decrease of 228,000 acres. So we're at about 500,000 acres of cropland and pasture, 550, and we've lost about 228 since 1987. On the right-hand side, we have a report from the American Farmland Trust, which attempted to document what the largest threats were between the period of 2001 and 2016 to Vermont agriculture. Certainly some was lost to high density urban development, but by and large, low density houses, smaller tracts are more of where development impacted agricultural lands. Here, just more data. Sorry.
Representative O'Brien's got a question.
One map I'd love to see is of the NRCS mapped prime ag land in Vermont. How much is being farmed?
We could do an analysis for you. I don't have that number figure off the top of my head, and as Ari will speak to, there are a number of different categories, right? The definition of what is prime agricultural soils, there's many categories: prime, statewide, soils of local significance, and then in the Act 250 process, if the land is being farmed, even if it doesn't meet those criteria, there is reason to hold them as a primary agricultural soil in the review process. And so it is not always just restricted to the prime and statewide soils, but that definitely is a place to look. So we already will dig into that. Just arming you with, or just throwing some more grist into the conversation about how current use is one program that's available to support keeping land in working state. In the past 10 years, we've seen a 5,000 acre decrease in ag land enrollment and a 238,000 acre increase in forest acres being enrolled in the current use program. It's important to note in that agricultural category, sugar bush can be included in those agricultural acres. And so it's not strictly cropland and pasture that is reflected in those agricultural acres, which is why that figure is pretty high. So the importance of protecting Vermont's agricultural land is why the Agency of Ag, VHCB leads the way in partnership with USDA and their Ag Land Easement Program. VHCB has been able to conserve 164,000 acres of agricultural land on 765 farms since '87. So while we've lost 228 during that same time, they've been able to conserve 164, but there's still a large balance of farmland out there that's not permanently conserved for future ag use. And one big boon for the Inflation Reduction Act is further funding for the Ag Land Easement Program. So we're hoping to be able to find more willing landowners that would like to participate in that program and sell development rights and conserve their land. So moving into, that's just all the preview about land use trends and patterns and the current state of agriculture. Two specific programs that the agency participates in, and Ari will speak to the Act 250 Criterion 9B review. What we will send you, and these links are available on the PowerPoint that's posted on the website, are two reports. One is a review of land that has been impacted and set aside for offset mitigation through the 9B program, a review of what's happening with that land. And then on the right is the annual report that the agency submits for the Section 248 proceedings, where the agency reviews the prime ag soil question for energy projects. But to summarize, there is a difference in how the statutory language sets up the framework for review between those two programs. And that last section of the bill at hand may be attempting to address that difference between how and when fees are applied to impact ag soils. So I will stop my sharing and answer any questions and be prepared to turn over to Ari, who can walk us through his role in reviewing prime soils.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. Is Ari here on Zoom?
Yes, she has it.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Good. And I didn't mean to send you away, Ryan, if I don't see any questions, so we'll bring you back up if we need to. We're all fine. Ari, thank you for joining us. And you've been listening in?
I have been, yeah. Good to be here. Ari Rockman-Miller, Senior Agricultural Development Coordinator with the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets.
Great. Well, welcome. So we're looking at a bill H128, and part of that is Section 2. I'm assuming you know this, but Section 2 deals with mitigation, forest products, industries, and if we just wanted to get a better understanding of what it actually means in practice.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to be here. I think kind of similar to Ryan, I'm going to give you a quick overview, if you don't mind me sharing my screen, and specific to the Criterion 9B review process that you ask about. I guess I'm not able to share my screen. Is it possible to make that happen?
You can also just at the end of the meeting, just email me what it is you're going to share. That'd be great.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Glad to
Permission
know that as well.
Do that now. Go ahead.
Sorry, what's that?
You're all set. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Okay, are you seeing that?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, great. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the Criterion 9B review that the agency does for primary agricultural soils. So the agency is a statutory party under Criterion 9B. So we review projects that are proposing to impact primary agricultural soils, or PAS, in the Act 250 process. 9B, or primary ag soils, is one of 10 Act 250 criteria, as well as additional sub-criteria. And the burden is on the applicant to establish compliance with 9B. Just want to note that all mitigation that takes place with 9B or recommended permit conditions that the agency recommends are ultimately subject to approval by the Natural Resources Board, or NRB, district commissions. So just a quick, I'm not going to read through all this, but a quick, showing you the criterion itself, 9B, how it's presented in statute. And I think what I'll emphasize here is that there really is a rigorous framework for review and mitigation of primary ag soil impacts under 9B. It states in relevant part that either the proposed subdivision or development will not result in any reduction in the agricultural potential of the primary agricultural soils, or, and this is my own words, if an applicant is proposing to impact those ag soils, because of course it happens. If you look at the final part of that, item number 4 there, if ag soils are to be impacted, suitable mitigation will be provided for any reduction in the agricultural potential of the primary ag soils caused by the development or subdivision. And there's a section of statute reference there, section 6093 of Title 10, that kind of really lays out a framework for on or off-site mitigation of impacts to primary agricultural soils. So here's the definition of primary agricultural soils. I know there was a question as to whether forested land could be considered primary ag soils. And the underlying question is really, well, the starting point at least is, are the soils mapped by the Natural Resources Conservation Service of USDA as being important farmland of prime, statewide, or local importance? And those typically align with NRCS agricultural value groups of 1 to 7. A couple exceptions there for local soils, but typically 1 is kind of the primest of the prime, and 7 is still an excellent soil of statewide importance, but not as good as the prime tier 1. So of course, not all mapped soils are still primary agricultural soils. For example, much of downtown Burlington is mapped as primary ag soils, and obviously, it's not all primary ag soil today. So there's another part of the inquiry as to unless, so the presumption is that mapped soils do meet the definition unless the commission determines the soils have lost their agricultural potential. So there are certain factors that are considered, most commonly a pre-existing impact, like if something was already paved over, that could take a mapped soil outside the definition. But again, the presumption is that mapped soils that are prime, statewide, or local, even if they have trees on them, if they retain agricultural potential, so the potential of the underlying resource, they would meet the definition. There's also a separate prong of the definition for soils the commission finds to be of agricultural importance due to present or recent agricultural use, regardless of the rating of those soils. So, like I said, the agency is a statutory party in the review process. We review applications for jurisdictional development under Act 250 that are proposing to impact PAS, and we issue review letters with recommendations to the NRB district commissions. We often review site plans that kind of have soils data on them that are submitted by the applicant, the permit history of a project, aerial imagery and mapping, site visits when they're needed, and the content of our review, the agency's review, is focused on first whether the soils in question meet the definition of a primary agricultural soil. Next, the acreage of proposed impacts. Are you impacting 2 acres or 25 acres or 200 acres? How many acres mitigation are warranted with the applicable multipliers, which I'll get to in a minute. And then also the sufficiency of a proposed on-site mitigation area to make sure that it kind of meets the statutory standard for on-site mitigation lands.
So I'm sorry, can you just pause for a second? You mentioned, and I think we heard this last week too, possibly different numbers. So 1 through 5 or 1 through 7?
Right.
For classifying the soil?
Right. So NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, they provide an excellent foundation for these reviews they have already mapped all of the soils in the state, and they have assigned agricultural value groups that are between, well, they could, for primary ag soils, they're typically between 1 and 7. 1 is prime, 2 and 3 are usually prime, usually 4 through 7, or at least 5 through 7 are statewide importance. It varies a little bit, but 1 through 7 are typically the agricultural value groups that kind of align with primary agricultural soils here in Vermont. There are some soils that are actually considered locally important that may be ag value group 8. But if a local municipality or a region has planning commission has designated these soils as locally important through a certain process, those could also be a primary ag soil. So if a soil is like ag value group 10, let's say, or 11 or 12, that's getting to be usually not a primary ag soil unless it has a history or recently being farmed. And soils that are ag value group 12, for example, might have a slope limitation or other types of limitations. But 1 to 7 is kind of the primary ag soils typically.
Okay, good. So there's the primary would 1 through 7 encompasses primary, and anything higher than that generally speaking, would not be primary ag soil.
Right, unless it was a local soil or an agricultural use. Correct. Yeah, so prime is the top tier of primary ag soils.
And okay, thank you for making that distinction. And in the context of the bill that we're looking at, are we talking about prime or primary?
Primary.
Okay.
Primary is a broader term.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Yeah, good questions. So, and here you see sort of the prime and locally important soils as mapped. I'm not saying all of these meet the definition today, but the mapping is kind of the starting point, and this is the ANR Atlas, and the green color is some of the prime, the best. The pink is statewide, the purple is statewide B, which means statewide with a possible wetness limitation. And here is actually the most up-to-date agricultural value groups are going to be found in the USDA NRCS Web Soil Survey. So this is a great online tool that really breaks down a number of aspects of the soils, including the Vermont Ag Value Group. So we use both the ANR Atlas as well as the NRCS Web Soil Survey in the agency's 9B reviews. So here we have some of the agricultural value groups that I referenced, and you can see the multipliers that are specified in statute. Statute essentially says, to paraphrase, that outside of designated areas, more on that in a minute, that the multiplier shall be at least 2 and no more than 3. So kind of pursuant to that, there are multipliers based on the ag value group, with again, 1 being the primest of the prime, so it has the highest multiplier. And then you can see ag value 5 to 7, a multiplier of 2. And there are some designated areas where there's a 1-to-1 ratio, and I'll touch on that in just a second. On-site mitigation is the default form of mitigation of primary ag soils outside of designated areas. And those designated areas are specifically defined in the context of 10 V.S.A. section 6093. On-site mitigation essentially consists of setting aside land for present and future agricultural use on the project tract that is capable of supporting an economic or commercial agricultural operation. So it's important those soils be available for present and future ag use. And that's enforceable by permit condition issued by the commission.
Got a question here, Representative O'Brien.
All right, once a site has been developed and mitigation has gone through, are those soils removed from the map? If it was had a criteria of 1, is it no longer considered potential ag soil, even if it, say, was redeveloped?
That's a good question. So sometimes NRCS, and again, NRCS does the mapping itself, sometimes they will designate certain soils as fill. There's like a map unit for fill or other, types of urban buildup. And it's clearly kind of, has that designation removed, that it's no longer a statewide soil, it's fill. But that's kind of actually more unusual. More often, the soils would still be mapped as prime or statewide, but then in the context of the 9B review, we would work with the applicant to determine if those soils have pre-existing impacts that might take them outside of the definition of a primary ag soil.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So quickly touching upon offsite mitigation, this is the default for projects within the designated areas. And those type of designated areas are on this slide, and they're, more importantly at 10 V.S.A. section 6093. But essentially offsite mitigation consists of a fee into the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board Offsite Mitigation Fund, which is administered by VHCB to preserve PAS of equal or greater value to those being impacted and prioritizing prime soils. And VHCB leverages these funds, often with other state, federal, or locally available funds, to achieve impressive, important farmland conservation outcomes through permanent conservation easements that are often on active, established farms. There's a price per acre by district which is based on the recent price to acquire conservation easements on farmland in the same region. And offsite mitigation, like I said, is the default within these designated areas. And within those specifically defined designated areas, there is a 1-to-1 ratio in statute. Also, industrial parks as defined and permitted by Act 250 and in existence as of January 1st, 2006, may be eligible as well for a 1-to-1 ratio. So there are kind of narrowly defined specific types of areas where the 1-to-1 mitigation ratio could apply in the context of offsite mitigation fee, as opposed to the on-site mitigation context where the multipliers always apply in my experience. And then one other thing to point out is that while offsite mitigation is the default outside the designated areas, excuse me, it's the default inside the designated areas. For projects outside designated areas, there are still many cases where applicants utilize an offsite mitigation fee, but it requires a finding of appropriate circumstances for mitigation flexibility by the district commission to enable the exercise of offsite mitigation fee or a combination of onsite and offsite mitigation if you're outside of a designated area. So there's a little more of a hurdle for the applicant to demonstrate that appropriate circumstances test applies, which is defined in an NRB statement of procedure on preservation of primary ag soils. So yeah, I think that kind of covers the main things I wanted to touch upon today, and I'm glad to take any questions.
So the designated areas then, just back on the previous slide there, those are essentially developed, I mean, we think of them as centers of towns. So the logic is that there wouldn't be necessarily on-site land that you could conserve because it's already been developed?
I think that's part of the logic. It's also kind of a planning consideration. Like if you're in a designated growth center, for example, which might go a little beyond the immediate downtown, maybe there's a planning goal that those soils would be suitable for development. So there's other factors as well that are kind of also reflected in the appropriate circumstances test.
Questions? Representative O'Brien.
Ari, during mitigation, I guess in collaboration with VHCB, can non-prime ag soil sites be considered? You know, so I think we heard last year there may have been a quarry that was preserved, or important wetlands. Can that trade be negotiated?
So is the question, Representative, whether non-primary agricultural soils could be used for on-site mitigation?
Right. If there's a potential to swap, say, a really important bog for your 20 acres of prime ag soil, if all parties were in agreement, or does it have to be that test with the multiplier?
I think I understand the question, but I'm sorry, could you repeat it one more time?
So, right, say I'm developing prime ag soils,
right,
and to meet the mitigation requirements, a site is identified that isn't necessarily a 1-to-1 or a 3-to-1 type of deal, but more an important natural feature, say, for example. So, can those negotiations happen, or is it very strict as far as we need to conserve, equal or multiplier pieces of property?
Good question. So typically for on-site mitigation, it would be on the project tract or kind of part of the permitted project in some way. So that one important thing is that on-site mitigation needs to be enforceable by a permit condition issued by the commission. So there has to be kind of a jurisdictional nexus to the project tract. So that's kind of one consideration. And then the other consideration is that typically statute does direct that the mitigation soils be roughly at least as good, if not better, than the soils being impacted. So we're kind of not having a net loss of agricultural value. Does that address the question?
And to jump in here, Ari, if I can, just to try to answer the question or flesh out a bit more, the review for on-site mitigations, it has to be the same type of soils, right? It has to be ag soil potentially. You can't conserve a class 2 wetland and say, oh, this is going to substitute for my impacts of primary agricultural soils. Now it has to be able to be farmed, and it has to be the same quality of soils or better for the mitigation.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, I think we'll let you go, although I just wanted to ask whether maybe you're not the right person to ask. When, in the context of this bill, we're talking about changing the ratio from either somewhere between 2 and 3 to 1 to 1 to 1. And I'm trying to think in terms of dollars. What would that be? Should I ask you that question or another source?
I think it would depend on the project region, like which district it's in, and it would depend on the recent applicable cost to conservation. So it really can vary as far as like which district you're in. I guess as far as the per acre fees per district go, the most recent kind of schedule, they vary by district. I think like the lowest fee per acre that's currently applicable would be District 8 is 1,577 per acre was kind of the most recent price per acre there. The highest would be currently applicable would be District 4 right now is $4,783 per acre. So it does depend on the district and as well as the timing of the application and kind of the recent price per acre on primary agricultural soils.
Those dollar figures are adjusted annually. Are they set somewhere in statute? And who makes those determinations?
Statute does direct that they be that those figures would be based on the recent price per acre within the geographic region to acquire agricultural conservation easements. So it's in statute, but the agency reviews data from VHCB closings to determine the recent price per acre.
Thank you very much. All right, I don't see any other questions. So we'll let you go, and I think we'll ask Gus to give us 5 minutes to stretch because we've been going for an hour plus, I think, here. And maybe we'll get the answers to all the rest of our questions.
Thank you so much.